Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my LPL playoff primer video for spring of 2023. The regular season is done and dusted. Of course, I've covered all 10 weeks of the LPL this regular season. You can check that out in the playlist that's linked up in the iCard right now. But in this video, we're going to be going over everything that you need to know going into the playoffs. We're going to be talking about all 10 teams that made the playoffs here in the LPL. We're going to be talking about how I think the bracket is going to shake out, maybe some, predictions at the end of the video, how the first round matchups in particular are going to end up being, because that's the next video that comes out. And then I'm also going to be giving you my awards for the regular season here in 2023. So I hope you guys are excited. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. These videos are always very controversial. I've been doing the recaps every single week, but this is kind of the culmination of everything we've been doing up until this point in the year for the LPL, and so I'm excited to get into it. I'm excited to talk about it, but there's certainly going to be some controversial opinions. There always are when you talk about awards, MVP, Rookie of the Split, All-Pro, that kind of stuff. Players are always getting snubbed. Other people are always going to have different opinions than you, so if you enjoy this video, hit the like button, of course, as we go through it, but also let me know down in the comment section below what your picks are. Of course, be respectful about it. We can have different opinions, and we can both be right. There's a lot of good players in the LPL, and certainly enough of them that it makes me feel bad to leave some of these players off, but I'll talk about that as we get further into the video. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. We're actually going to start off with the awards. We've done that in every other one, so we're going to do that here as well. We're going to be going over MVP, Rookie of the Split, as well as my 3 All-Pro picks, my first team, second team, third team in all 5 positions, so I'm excited to jump into that. But of course, we're going to be kicking it off with the big one, with Most Valuable Player, and I really take that title to heart. If you guys don't know my criteria, I've talked about this in a couple of my other playoff primer videos. But my personal criteria when it comes to how I value players in terms of awards is this theoretical question that I ask myself of how many wins do I think you added to your team this year? Now, obviously, to add wins, your team has to win at least a little bit, right? But for the most part, you don't have to be on the best team in the league in order to get MVP. It certainly helps because you won a lot of games and you were probably a little bit more dominant, but you can have a player that is a little bit, more useful to his team that maybe doesn't play for like the top 1 or 2 team in the region, and without that player, maybe, that team struggles a lot more. So that's kind of my idea of MVP. Obviously, it's another thing to point out, because I get a lot of criticism for this. This is not a player rankings section. This is not the 3 best and most talented players in every role when I do the All-Pro, or the most talented player in the league. These rankings are not based on who I think would win if they were playing against each other in lane. This is more so, who do I think had the biggest impact on their team's regular season. This is specifically for the games that have already happened, not the ones in the future. So that's a little disclaimer out of the way. But with all of that being said, it's time to go over my MVP pick for Spring Split 2023, and it was close, but I ended up landing on Scout, the LNG mid laner, getting the MVP award here. I don't think a lot of people are going to be entirely surprised by this. I certainly think he has earned it. He has been the most consistent carry in the LPL, in my opinion, so far in 2023. You can see some of the honorable mentions. Those are my 2 and 3, if you will. I had Ruler at number 2. I had Elk at number 3. I felt like these 3 players in particular were able to win a lot of games for their teams this split, but Scout was just on a different level when it came to consistency over, basically the entire split. I was going to say the second half, but even that's not true. He was really good in the first half. Over the entirety of this split, he was so dominant for LNG in the mid lane. I don't want to say he was dragging them across the finish line because they have good players elsewhere, but they funneled a lot of their resources through him, and it led them to their best season in quite a while. They're the 3 seed here, and that is not where they were projected at the beginning of the split. Scout has really stepped up. He has really been able to dominate a position that is historically really good in the LPL, and it was really good again this split, and you just got to give him a lot of credit for that. He's been able to do it on a lot of different types of champions, obviously things like the Ryze and the Azir that he's been playing for years, but the Jace was a huge pick in the LPL just in general for a lot of different players in 2023, and Scout was definitely one of the players that I think was capitalizing on that the most. He was really, really good, and for me, especially after reviewing some of the tape in preparation for this video, there just wasn't another option. He clearly stood out as the MVP, but I do want to give a lot of credit to Ruler. I want to give a lot of credit to Elk. Both of those players, I think, elevated their teams. Obviously, Ruler on the #1 team in the region in JDG, or the team that finished first place. And that's pretty good, right? I think he was the most impactful player on the best team in the league, but I do think that he had other teammates that maybe stole the spotlight a little bit too much for him to be considered my MVP this split. And then Elk. BLG didn't have nearly as good of a finish and nearly as good of a season as LNG did, but I think you could argue that Elk had an even harder carry job on that team where, there were just games where he was dragging them across the finish line. So overall, I think Scout's a nice combination of both. Team success and being able to win games super consistently, legitimately being a threat to win the LPL title, as well as, being the central focal point of that team, the one that they want to dump resources into, the one that they want to play through. That, to me, was Scout. You'll notice my the numbers on the screen: LPL Player of the Game Awards, Player of the Series. Broadcast is on top. My rankings are on bottom. The numbers are going to be a little bit of a disparity because LPL gives out Player of the Game every game, whereas I only give out, Player of the Series, which is 1 per series. But having 7 Player of the Series in their 16 series this year, I think they won 13 series this year, and for him to get Player of the Series in 7 of those, it's just a ludicrous amount. It really goes to show the amount of dominance that Scout was able to show over the course of the spring split. And then moving on to my Rookie of the Split. LPL isn't going to be doing a Rookie of the Split. I don't think any of the regions are. They end up going to a Rookie of the Year system, and I totally understand that, and I'll probably do the same towards the back half of the year. Obviously, I'll continue to count these guys as rookies going into summer, but I do want to acknowledge maybe some of the players that have been able to step in and contribute immediately at a high level, even if they haven't been playing in a major region before. And while MVP was definitely up for discussion, Scout ended up being my pick, but I think you could realistically give it to quite a few people. I don't think Rookie of the Split is really all that up for discussion. This was a pretty easy choice. I'm going to go ahead and give it to Leave on the side of EDG, the AD carry from Weibo Gaming. He was just awesome this split, immediately being able to step into that team and fill in for Viper, who was one of the best AD carries in the world last year. To see Leave come in and really progress, I would say, over the course of the split. Obviously, his team fighting was always exceptional. Basically, from day one, that was my scouting report on him. You can go check that spring preseason predictions video that I did at the beginning of the year, and I was talking about how Leave was probably going to fit in and be great from moment one. Watching him in the LDL, it looked like, an unfair advantage to have a player like Leave on your team. He was just so dominant over that league, easily the best player that I watched in the LDL over the past year or so, and he immediately stepped in and kind of translated that to the LPL level, which is not an easy thing to do, especially on a team that ended up finishing top 2 in the standings. He played a lot of late game carries, a lot of Zeri, a lot of Aphelios, because that's the style, but I think what really impressed me the most was his development over the course of the year when it came to playing in lane. Now, obviously, playing with Mako is just generally going to make you better at that part of the game, because Mako is so good, and he's able to develop AD carry talent like nobody else in the history of League, basically. But, Leave has to get a lot of credit for actually being able to develop. You'll notice the Caitlyn actually in his top 3 most played champions, and he was undefeated on it. This was a pick that they were going to towards the middle of the split, and it's something that I would not have expected a team like EDG and a player like Leave to want to play towards in 2023. So, impressive stuff, impressive development. My big worry for the league is that he's only going to get better. I mean, we could be looking at Leave within the next 2 years as a top 2, top 3 AD carry in the entire world. Like, that's the kind of upside that he has as a player, and he absolutely showed that in this rookie split. Honorable mentions for me: You Should Know Me in the top lane. It's really hard not to include him on the honorable mentions, but I do have to point out that he really fell off towards the back half of the split, even when he was playing. Obviously, he didn't play over the last, I think, 2 weeks of the split, but even before that, he was really not all that good for, I would say, a good section of the second half of 2023, but that first couple of weeks, week 1, week 2, week 3, he might have been like the leading MVP favorite in the entire league, and so I gotta give him some credit for going on that super hype run, but as soon as he got figured out, I think he got stopped a little bit more consistently. It'll be interesting to see if he can adapt to that as we move on in his career. And then the other honorable mention for me is going to be Hang on WE. He was super volatile, super hit or miss, very aggressive in the early game, able to generate a lot of leads in that jungle position, but really struggled translating it into the mid game. But even still, like, being able to generate such consistent leads in the LPL and actively winning games for a playoff team at this level when you are a player that, had some hype going in, but wasn't necessarily someone that I think a lot of people were looking at in the same way that I was looking at someone like Leave on EDG, right? He wasn't supposed to be one of the best junglers in the league or anything like that, but there were games where he just obliterated his opponents. He absolutely has to be mentioned, but talking about You Should Know Me and Hang, they have their caveats. Leave really doesn't. He was basically the perfect rookie, and he has slotted into to EDG in that AD carry spot just about as well as you could have ever hoped. But now that we've covered the two big individual awards that I give out at the beginning of these videos, it's time to jump into the All-Pro sections. I'll be going through all three All-Pro teams, my first team, my second team, and my third team. I'll essentially be giving you a fourth team as well when I talk about my honorable mentions for that final team, but this is the most controversial part of the video, no question. There's always going to be people that disagree with my takes, and honestly, I encourage that. I would be entirely shocked if you look at my All-Pro and go, that's exactly mine, all 15 players, it's exactly the same. That would be surprising to me. I did go for some crazy ones, especially towards the back half of this list, so I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts, opinions. Obviously, it's just one man's opinion. This is just what I'm voting for, but everybody, your opinion is just as valuable as mine, but this is coming from someone who has watched every single LPL game. You guys know what I value if you watch the channel. I value consistency, I value ability to actively win games for your team, and that's really kind of the overarching theme, again, of like adding wins, and so keep that in mind as we go through this. But let's go ahead and start this off with our first team All-Pro, and it's up on the screen now. I'm excited to go over this, and let's go ahead and go from top to support. In the top lane, it's Ale from Edward Gaming. In the jungle, Jeje from Edward Gaming. In the mid lane, Scout from LNG, obviously he's MVP. In the bot lane, Ruler from JD Gaming, and in the support position, Ming from RNG, and that may surprise some people. We'll go in order, we'll get to Ming, I promise. A lot of people are not going to have a player from RNG even close to first team, but I'll kind of explain why I think he was the most valuable support in the league this split. But starting off with top side, you got your two EDG players starting it up. Ale in the top lane. Honestly, top lane was kind of a difficult role to rank. There really weren't a lot of, exceptional top laners in the LPL this split. Ale was clearly the best of the bunch, though, in my opinion. His mechanical skill over everybody else in the league was very paramount, in my opinion, and I think he added the most amount of versatility and volatility to his team. A lot of the ups and downs that he experienced with his time on LNG seem to have disintegrated. They are gone. He was really consistently good this year for a team that absolutely needed him to be. I was a little bit concerned that, bringing a player like Levin, who wants to play for team fights, and then having a player like Fofo, who didn't necessarily have a great 2022, that Ale was going to be given a little bit too much pressure to carry these games, especially early on, and, sometimes that can kind of get under his feet, but I think this team has meshed so well, and a lot of that has been Ale just getting significantly more consistent. In my opinion, probably the easiest choice for first team All-Pro of anybody in this list was Ale for me. And then Jeje in the jungle. I think, honestly, his split has gone under the radar. He was so good for EDG, and I think I would make the case that he was the best player for EDG over the course of the regular season. Certainly the most important. He was really, really up and down in 2022. I think people underestimate just what his regular season was, especially in summer. There was a reason that when he got replaced in summer that the team actually started doing better. It's because he didn't really have a good grasp of the meta, and he didn't exactly know where he wanted to put a lot of his pressure, but all of those problems are gone. He meshed well with everybody on EDG, most specifically Fofo in the mid lane, and his carry instincts absolutely came out, but that's not to say he's not a great facilitator as well. He was the most well-rounded and complete jungler in the league this year, and that's why he's my first team All-Pro. Of course, Scout, I've already talked about him quite a bit. In the mid lane there, he's going to be my first team. He's the MVP, has to be first team. He was the most valuable player in the league. And then Ruler in the bot lane. I know some people are a little bit lower on Ruler. I just don't get it. I think it's a little bit, I don't know, voter fatigue. That's really the only thing that I can say, is I've seen a lot of people not put him first team All-Pro. I think this is an absolute no-brainer for me. I do think that, we'll get to second team. You already know who it is. I think Elk, has a conversation for being in the first team, but Ruler was just the most valuable AD carry in the league to me. He was the most valuable player on the best team in the entire league, and it really didn't take a lot of thought to put him on that first team. He's the same Ruler that we had last year. He's just on a team with really good players now, just like he was last year, right? And then Ming in the support position. Again, a lot of people are going to see RNG finishing, what were they, 9th? And they're going to be like, no shot a team in 9th place can get a first-team All-Pro player. And I kind of understand that thinking, right? Like, if you're going to add wins to your team, you have to win games eventually, right? But I would argue that almost all of RNG's wins this year were because of bot lane. I think topside was miserable and very, very feast or famine, very inconsistent, especially jungle, especially mid lane. There just wasn't a lot of consistency coming out with this team, and as soon as Ming came back to RNG, I mean, that switch completely flipped in the bottom lane. To me, he won the most amount of games for his team of any support in the entire league. If RNG did not have Ming, I truly don't believe they make playoffs, no matter how good Gala or even like Wei or Breathe or Angel or anybody on that team is. I think if they do not bring back Ming, this team is nowhere near playoffs, and that's kind of the difference here. I think that there are very few supports in the entire league that have impacted the game in the way that Ming has impacted him, but I've already been called a Ming dick rider in the past by a lot of other, a lot of comments. Last year I called him the best support in the world. I still think he absolutely has, some level of claim to that title. Obviously, carry is a little bit untouchable right now, but Ming is, in my opinion, the best AD carry in the LPL and was the most valuable to his team. But then we can move on to my second team All-Pro. First team, I think a lot of those are going to be relatively popular. Ale, Jeje, Scout, even Ruler I don't think is like crazy out there. But second team is where we start to get to some of the players that either people think were snubbed from first team or players that some people consider too high, if you will. I still think it's pretty standard. A lot of the surprises come in third team, I guess. But my second team All-Pro is up on the screen now. Let's go ahead and go over who is gaming in the bot lane. Elk from Bilibili Gaming, and in the support position, Mako from Edward Gaming. Again, another kind of group of players that I think is just generally regarded as really good, and I think all of them added value. I think all of them were first team All-Pro caliber players this year. It's just the LPL is one of those regions that's ridiculously stacked. I mean, this is an all-star lineup of talent and players, but I'm going to go ahead and go over why I think each player ended up getting it. 369 was actually I was a little hesitant on it because I'm going to be honest, I don't think a lot of games this split were affected by 369 as a player in the top lane, but I would generally say that top lane was just not very good for the LPL this split, at least in comparison to what it's been in years past. 369 talent-wise is absolutely right up here with anybody else on this list. It's not really a question. He's arguably a top 10 player in the entire world, but I think you could make a strong argument that he was the least valuable player on his own team in 2023. That's not to take away from the skill. He was consistently winning lane. He was consistently being able to generate leads. It's just not a lot of like game-winning plays, mostly because a lot of the game-winning plays were made by other players on JDG. It just feels like his team's success honestly detracts from his case a little bit, but like I said, not really a lot of other top laners that I think were vying to take that spot from him. In the jungle, it's Tarzan. I think Tarzan was phenomenal over the course of this split. Obviously, him and Scout I've talked about so much on this channel over the course of the year so far. They've worked so well as a duo. Arguably the most cohesive duo in the entire world right now, if not just the single best. Right, I think Tarzan more than earned his spot here on second team. We have to remember, Tarzan had a pretty poor 2022 regular season. He picked it up in playoffs where he was really good and almost pushed LNG to Worlds last year, but that regular season was a pretty huge disappointment from the team all around, and Tarzan was a big part of that. It feels like getting Scout in, having a clear purpose of which lane to play through, and then just kind of being able to repeat it game after game after game has really helped Tarzan. Mostly on the facilitators, but again, just really good at everything. It feels like Tarzan is fully back here. And then Knight in the mid lane. Knight's gonna go under the radar. Again, he does every year because players, people somehow look at him and say that he doesn't actually accomplish anything. I don't really understand the narrative surrounding that. Knight was, fourth in my MVP conversation. I only talked about the top three, but he would have been number 4 for me. He was awesome in the mid lane. He only comes in second team because Scout was so good, but Knight was legitimately one of the best players in the entire league again this year, and I think a lot of people were interested to see how he would mesh with a lot of other aggressive players and a lot of other resource-heavy players on JDG. I think it's meshed phenomenally. Him and Kanavi haven't always had the best synergy, but I think generally speaking, Knight's laning prowess has shined through. He's still the best laner in the LPL, in my opinion, and I think that was shown off this year. And he did a really good job translating a lot of those leads to the mid game, having Ruler come and help him, and their skirmishes were basically untouchable. Knight was a big part of that. Elk in the bot lane, I already talked about him a little bit, but man, BLG would be nowhere without Elk right now. He was hard carrying that team for a majority of this split. He just was awesome. All of the hope and promise that we were hoping to get when Elk got back onto an actually competitive team after spending the entire year in purgatory last year on Ultra Prime, it all came to fruition. It's really good to see him become one of the better AD carries in the LPL again after those years on WE, to kind of, see it drown out a little bit in 2022 on a team that just floundered no matter how well he played, and then for him to actually get on a roster that is able to close out games with him around them is a really good sign. I think Elk has a real case to be made to be the most valuable player to his single team in the entire region, but For me, he comes in just a little bit below Ruler. Again, top 3 in my MVP conversation. A really phenomenal split for Elk. He proved all of the doubters wrong. And then Mako is my second team support. I think a lot of people are going to put Mako as first team, and honestly, I can't disagree with that, even a little bit. Like, if you wanted to put Mako first team, I'm not even going to try and give you an argument as to why that's not correct. I think Mako was awesome in 2023. I think, him being there is a big reason Leave was able to adapt to the league so quickly, and he's just proven constantly that it doesn't really matter what the meta is, he's just going to be consistent. My only worry when it came to Mako was it did feel like in a lot of games he ended up getting outshined by his AD carry, but at the end of the day, like, that's his job, right? And so I'm not going to sit here and criticize anything that Mako did. He was basically the perfect support. I just think Meng was also basically the perfect support. They are two of the best supports in the entire world. You want to flip-flop them? I don't care. Like, EDG won more games, so I understand you wanting to put him first team, but both of them had a ridiculous amount of impact, and I think everybody here on the second team is a really phenomenal player that honestly is probably going to get overlooked because of the rest of the players on their teams. And then we move on to my final All-Pro team, my third team All-Pro. Incredibly excited to get to this. There are definitely some snubs on this list, but I think a lot of them are understandable, if only just because there are so many good players in the LPL. And I will be talking about my honorable mentions here as well, but my third team All-Pro is going to be up on the screen right now, and let's go ahead and go over it. In the top lane, it's Zika from LNG. In the jungle, it's Aki from OMG. In the mid lane, it's Fofo from Edward Gaming. In the bot lane, it's Gala from Royal Never Give Up. And in the support position, it's Crisp from Weibo Gaming. And so, let's go ahead and go over it. Obviously, I'll be talking about the players that are on here and then maybe giving you guys some context as to who some of the players I was deciding between were, and maybe if I was deciding to move these guys up, or if they ended up settling in third team. I think for the most part, top 2 teams felt pretty locked to me in almost every single position. It was really just third and like fourth and fifth that were a little bit up in the air for me. But starting in the top lane really wasn't up in the air for me. Zika was a super obvious choice for third team. It very much felt like a big difference between the top 3 top laners in the league and everyone else. I think there's even an argument to be made that Zika deserves to be higher on this list. I thought he was actually really consistent over the course of the year. He was positive in lane, he was winning quite frequently, and he was not causing issues for LNG. I just liked the way that he was able to play for this team. He was not a weak link at all, considering he had never really played on a team that was attempting to challenge for like a title before, and so overall just a really solid split from Zika. I think that there are a lot of people that see it as a massive gap between these 3 and basically everybody else in the LPL, and while I do agree, I think a couple of players went a little bit under the radar, and some people aren't going to like this, but I think Ching Tian at least deserves to be mentioned in this category. If he didn't get replaced, and if Wayward wasn't such a significant upgrade in the final week of the season, like, he certainly was one of the better top laners, I think, through the first, 4 or 5 weeks of the split here in the LPL. It's just unfortunate how bad the second half of his split was. That inconsistency really dropped him off the list, but outside of that, there really was no one else even in the conversation for me. I know there's going to be some hype for You Should Know Me, but I mean, truthfully, he wasn't even in consideration. He had such a miserable second half of the split that I didn't even really consider him for it. And outside of that, I don't even know. I don't really have any other honorable mentions. Those are really the only 2 that I can even bring up. But Zika felt pretty confident here in number 3. And again, if you wanted to move him up, maybe even number 2, I think he had maybe more of an impact on LNG's winning than 369 did, but I thought 369 just generally had a better split overall. So just however you feel like that. In the jungle, I had Aki. Again, this is another one where I felt pretty confident about putting Aki here in the third team. I think top 3 junglers were all incredibly important to their team's success throughout the split, and Aki in particular was just the single best player on a good OMG team, like a team that surprised a lot of people. The breakout split finally happened for the jungle there. I think we were all looking at like Shanji and Cream, and maybe in a perfect world like Abel and PP God as like these big breakout candidates for 2023 because they had kind of built to that. I was not looking at Aki, and Aki was the one who ends up being the best out of all of them this split. He won almost more games, I think you could argue, than any other jungler, but I do think he also had a couple more snafus throughout the middle of the season than maybe some of the others did. His good games were just as good as anybody in the LPL, and honestly, he had a lot of them, but he also had a couple of bad games here or there, and that made me a little bit more cautious about putting him higher than third team, but in my opinion, absolutely deserving of third team, was the heart and soul of an OMG team that was top 5 for like most of the split. So really good stuff coming from him. The other honorable mentions I want to point out, Karsa on Weibo. I think a lot of people are not going to look at Karsa, but just generally speaking, I think more supportive, more facilitative oriented junglers get a bad rep in the community. Karsa, Peanut definitely falls into that. They don't necessarily get the kind of credit they deserve. I think a lot of the hate that Karsa has gotten over the course of the year is just not well representative of what he was able to do this split. And Kanavi also has to be in the conversation, but I think Kanavi actually had a couple of games that really made me worry, and I just didn't get that from any of the top 3 teams, or the top 3 players at the position, so I felt pretty confident locking in these top 3. Then in the mid lane, another player that I felt pretty good about, Fofo, coming here for EDG. What a turnaround. I mean, what a 2023. He had a miserable 2022, gets signed on to that BLG team. They're really hoping to compete, but he completely flames out. He has a horrendous split. I mean, he's just not very good. He ends up getting replaced by Icon, and the team is much better with Icon than they are with Fofo. And then he gets placed on this team with EDG, trying to replace Scout, who obviously just won the MVP. Big shoes to fill for an organization that really hasn't been even remotely uncompetitive in their entire history, and you know what? He ends up making it work out. This very much felt like Rare Adam Fofo, maybe even a little bit better. He was so consistent throughout the year. He was winning a lot of games for the team. Mid lane's a tough position to rank in the LPL, and Fofo, to me, was clearly a top 3 player this split. The other player that I considered mostly was Xiaohu for this spot. I think Xiaohu's another player whose split's going to go underrated because he had some bad games, but he also had a ton of really, really good ones, especially in game 3s in the best of 3s. He was really important in closeout games, and one of the best players in the entire league when it came to those, but I thought Fofo was just significantly more consistent, which is why I went with him. Also, kind of an out there honorable mention that I want to give, Strive on Rare Adam. I know the team was garbage, and I know they didn't make playoffs, but I'm a big fan of what Strive was able to do, especially towards the beginning half of the split. He wasn't quite as dominant towards the second half, but I think discounting the first 5 weeks of the season is unfair when you're talking about a split-wide performance, and so kind of a sneaky honorable mention in Strive, but again, it really was just between Fofo and Xiaohu for this final spot. And then Gala in the bot lane, again, people are going to be critical that I have 2 RNG players in the All-Pro teams, but really, that bot lane was way better than it had any right to be. Gala was definitely a little up and down before Ming got there, but once Ming got there, he was completely locked and loaded. He looked like a top 4, top 5 AD carry in the world again, and to me, that's definitely good enough for 3rd team All-Pro. I do think this was by far, I wouldn't say by far, because we'll get to support, but this was one of the more contentious positions. I think both bot lane positions were really contentious, but, you know, missing out on a player like Leave, I think is really frustrating. It was really Gala versus Leave for me for that final spot, but Leave ended up getting Rookie of the Split, and so even if I think their performances were relatively equal, I thought Gala did more for his team, and also Leave already got a big award, but if you want to give him 3rd team, I totally get it. Another sneaky player on Invictus Gaming that I think definitely at least deserves a shout here. He was phenomenal for the first couple of weeks. I think you can make a really big argument that for like the first 5 weeks of the season, they were one of the best, if not the best bot lanes in the LPL, but I ended up settling on Gala just because of the mechanical dominance and the importance towards the team. Again, if you replace that bot lane, I do not think they're even remotely close to playoffs. That's how bad I think topside for RNG was this split. And then Crisp is going to get it in the support position. I think a lot of people are going to overlook Crisp on Weibo. I think the Shy, Karso, Xiaohu, very explosive players, even Light, are probably going to get a lot more notice and a lot more attention than a player like Crisp, but Crisp was really awesome in this split. His engages were really good when he was playing Engaged Champions, but I think he really stepped up his game on Enchanters, and I think he almost went underrated throughout most of the split and what he was able to do, especially in the early laning phase. But I will say, support was by far the hardest position to pick. This was loaded with talent. I mean, you want to go with On? I can't believe I couldn't put On this list. I really love how On played. On and Elk were a huge power bottom lane. I probably should have used a different terminology there, but I'm not cutting that. It's funny. They were a great strong side bot. On and Elk were, and I think maybe it was just the inconsistency that left him off the list for me. But 99% of years, On's gonna get an All-Pro nod for what he was able to do. A player like Missing doesn't get on this list. A player like PP God doesn't get on this list. Zhuo I thought was really good down the stretch. Even a player like Wink was really good over the first half of the split. There were a lot of players that I think you could, put in the conversation for All-Pro here, but I think Crisp was the one who probably had the biggest impact on his team's winning percentage, and again, that's why he ends up slotting in. But there were a lot of good players in the LPL. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on what your All-Pros are and, what you think of mine down in the comment section below. But now that we've covered all of the awards, now that we've gone over the regular season, it's time to preview the playoffs. In the playoffs, we shall preview indeed. The way that we're going to structure this next segment of the video, of course, we've got 10 teams to talk about now because there are 10 teams that make the playoffs in the LPL, but we're going to be talking about them a little bit different. We're going to start with the first 6 teams, the top 6 teams, the teams that get buys. Now, they don't all get the same buy. Obviously, 1 and 2 get a little bit more than 5 and 6, but we're going to talk about all of them because there's no matchups in round number 1 to talk about. We'll talk about their potential path, but we'll do more of a full bracket prediction at the end. And then once we get through those top 6 teams, I will be covering teams 7 through 10 in my matchup analysis. So we'll be talking about 7 versus 10. We'll be talking about 8 versus 9. I'll be giving my predictions on that. And then, of course, at the end, I'll give you my full bracket prediction. But starting us off, we're going to kick it off with our number 1 seed from the regular season. Let's talk about JD Gaming. They were number 1 in the regular season, although it wasn't always looking like that. They definitely went through some ups and downs, I would say, throughout the regular season. But at the end of the day, the talent came through and they were able to secure that number 1 seed with a 13-3 record, 28-8 overall, which is really good. And what I don't think a lot of the stats on the screen actually show you is just the sheer dominance that this team existed with when they did indeed win. They weren't always winning, like every single game, no matter what. They struggled a couple times. You know, the Weibo series jumps to mind. There are a couple others where it was like, this team's not exactly consistent. But when they won, they almost always won in decisive fashion. I mean, their wins were the most dominant of the split of any team. And that's kind of what we expected because their roster on paper is looking unbelievable. Their roster is looking like 3-6-9 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and Missing at support. Basically all-pro from top to bottom. Like, Kanavi and Missing aren't in my all-pro teams, but, I mean, to have 3 all-pros in the LPL is pretty darn good when there's 17 teams to kind of get from in the pool. It's just really impressive stuff coming out from JD Gaming, and, you know, to say that Kanavi and Missing are weak links by any stretch of the imagination is just absurd, and so JD Gaming is just unstoppable when they're playing well. 369, I've already talked about him a bit in this video. One of the most consistent top laners in the world, can carry, can be given resources, you know, can play Renekton at a really high level, can play, you know, Aurelia and the Jax and things like that at a high level as well. But, you know, on this team has definitely fallen into more of a weak side tank role. Things like the Cassante, things like the Gragas have been very big for him over the course of the split. I don't really expect that to change. A lot of what this team likes to do is generate leads on their jungler early and try to get those transitioned into the mid lane. I know that doesn't necessarily look like what's happening here when you look at, like, Ruler being, you know, maybe the best player on the team and, you know, having a ridiculous amount of forward percentage, but this team doesn't really skirmish all that much in the early game. They are able to generate leads, but a lot of it is individual leads. Ruler and Missing in particular are just so good in lane. They're able to generate massive CS leads. Same thing for Knight. He's just able to generate consistent CS leads, and then the mid game is where this team really picks up and becomes, like, generally unbeatable. Like, anywhere from 12 to 18 minutes into the game, there's just not a lot that teams do against JD Gaming, especially if you don't have the talent to be able to go one-on-one with players like Knight and Ruler in lane. When you're behind that far, they really know how to take a lead that might be a little bit small, you know, like 1K at like 12 minutes, and just completely blow it out of proportion within the next 4 to 5. They have great objective control, and a lot of it, again, just comes from the fact that they are incredibly consistent. Like I said earlier, Knight and Ruler are probably the most dangerous carry duo in the entire league. There just isn't a single team that is going to be able to shut down both of them consistently throughout a series. You're going to have to expect at least one of them to come up and perform. Now, there are ways to beat JD Gaming, and a lot of that relies on the fact of needing to get them behind in the early game. We've seen situations where this team can be a little, I don't want to say not proactive, but a little bit passive in the early game, and I think other teams can definitely take advantage of that in certain situations where if they make a lot of ridiculously early and aggressive plays, I think that there is a window to be able to generate that kind of lead, but being able to keep it is an entirely different story. Kanavi last year was the best jungler in the world, maybe outside of Peanut. Knight was arguably the best mid, Ruler was arguably the best bot, and Missing was arguably the best support. 369 was arguably the best top. I mean, on paper, this is one of the best teams, and they have proven that they absolutely, at the very least, deserve that moniker, and that easily makes them one of the biggest threats in the LPL to hoist that trophy, which is something I think a lot of us had been predicting basically the whole season for them. And then moving on to the 2 seed, while the 1 seed in JD Gaming was relatively predictable at the beginning of the split, I don't think a lot of people saw a great season coming out from the 2 seed here, because it is Edward Gaming, EDG, coming in at the number 2 seed and being in that top 2, which is massive. Remember, the top 2 teams at the end of the tournament go to MSI, and obviously being in the top 2 gives you such an advantage. You have by far the biggest margin for error is, I guess, the term I want to use, because you're one of 2 teams. You know, 1 and 2 are the only 2 teams that guarantee to be in loser's bracket. At the very worst, you have that extra life opportunity available to you for your regular season performance, and they earned it. They were really, really clinical in the regular season, and I'm excited to see what they're actually going to be able to get done in the postseason. But their lineup is looking like Ale in the top lane, Jeje in the jungle, Fofo in the mid lane, Leave at AD carry, and Mako At support, they are the only team in the LPL to have every single player either on an All-Pro or win an award. Everybody is on All-Pro except for Leave, who won Rookie of the Split, and realistically, I mean, Leave was probably right around the third best AD carry in the league. I just wanted to give some shoutouts to Gala, but EDG looks unstoppable in the way that they have been playing recently. A lot of these players have developed a fantastic synergy. They have a really clear game plan in how they want to play, where they want to allocate resources, and I think that definitely shows up in their champion pool. When you look at someone like Ale, his most played champion this split is Scion, and it's a weak side tank that can, kind of absorb pressure in the early game, but can still be really useful in team fights, and most notably has a lot of split pushing power as well, if you really want to go down that route. And then you've got things like the Kennen, the Renekton, flankers that do want to do a lot of things in team fights, while also having nice lane pressure early. They want to leave Ale on an island, and they want him to win. They don't want him to just kind of sit there and take it. The Kennen, the Renekton, these are things that don't really need a lot of attention in order to be able to generate leads, and then he can make that impact known throughout the mid game, but mostly in these late game team fights where I think this team really stands out. And when you're talking about late game, that's where Leave and Mako come in. Now, not to say that they can't play aggressive early, but Zeri Annie has been an absolutely massive bot lane for this team over the course of the year so far, and they don't really invest a lot into the bot lane early. They trust that Leave and Mako are going to be able to survive, and then, like I talked about with Leave early, he's one of the single best team fighting AD carries in the LPL, if not the single best. He's just so consistent with damage and his positioning, and he's never really caught out in awful positions that he often puts EDG in such a generous spot to be able to play from that point onwards in the game. Obviously, Mako helps in the early phase. I think that's where he really comes into play, as his laning is so good that Leave maybe not being the best laner is a little bit accounted for, but it's okay because EDG have a place on the map where they can put a lot of that pressure. That, of course, being the mid-jungle duo, who I could have never guessed in a million years would work as well together as they have. Jeje has been the #1 jungler in the league so far this year. Fofo was looking very close to that for the mid lane position, especially at the beginning part of the year. Not as flashy, I would say, in the back half, but they still work together at an incredibly high level, and you can see that in how they play. Jeje has been great on these facilitators, but more so these early game champions that can generate leads. He wants to put those leads into the mid lane for someone like Fofo to be able to create resources for everybody else on the map. With 7-1 on Jace. Jace is a massive pick for a lot of different LPL mid laners this year, and Fofo most specifically. Obviously, he's always been great on the control mages. My mind goes to things like Zoe when it comes to him as a player, but Jace is definitely right in line with that, and he's been playing it at a super high level. JJ likes to generate those early resources on things like Vi, and then translate them into the mid lane so that Fofo can get ahead. You can usually use that pressure to kind of move around the map, control objectives is really what they like to do, and then basically from that point onwards, you're just hoping that if you run into a team fight that Zeri or that Aphelios is going to be able to gain some gold and then just run over the game from that point onwards. It's a good strategy, and it's something that really hasn't failed for them at all this year. The only real times that they have lost, they've kind of moved away from things like that. They've gone to a more mid lane carry-oriented style in the late game, and it just hasn't necessarily worked in the same way. But when EDG is clicking, when they have a good idea of how they want to play the game and when they can execute on it, they're going to be a very, very difficult team to actually beat, and that is absolutely the case here. I think their upper ceiling, in my opinion, is winning the LPL trophy. That shouldn't be a shot coming from second place, but I think they have a much better case for it than a lot of people would expect. I think a lot of people out there are going to pick a team like EDG to be able to win the LPL, and I don't think it's outlandish at all to consider that. I think this team is really, really fun to watch. Now, what are their flaws? What are their exploitable, aspects of the game? Well, they invest a lot of pressure into trying to secure objectives, and I think enemy teams that do a better job of being able to set up early and being able to out-macro them or really just get a lot of prio in things like bot and mid lane are going to have a much easier time actually going up against EDG in that same vein, because if EDG doesn't easily have access to these fights, oftentimes what they do is try to force them. Now, they're good enough to be able to get away with that in most cases, but against teams like JDG, against teams like LNG, the talent difference might not be big enough for them to force their way into situations like that. So that's the one area I could see teams actively trying to take advantage of when it comes to EDG, but most of the time, it's not even really on the table. They do so well in the early game to be able to avoid disaster and then take advantage of their strong mid game that, it's going to be very difficult to capitalize on, but if you can get that push, it's definitely possible. I would say, if I had to predict, though, this team is going to be an incredibly difficult out, basically for anyone. I could see circumstances in which they could falter, but they seem like a team that is really going to excel once we get into best of fives. But that's going to do it for our top 2 seeds. It's time to move on to seed number 3, of course. Everybody's grouped in groups of 2 until we get to the bottom 4, and so we start our new group here with number 3, and coming in as the 3rd seed, it's another team tied at 13-3 with a slightly worse game record. We have LNG Esports coming in at 3, and again, I can't say this enough, this team is really fun to watch, and they have already over-exceeded so many expectations that I think all of us had for them. I had them 7th in my preseason power rankings. That has clearly just turned out to be wrong. But even I was really high on Tarzan and Scout. I just didn't expect it to come together this well. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is Zika in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, LP at AD carry, and Hang at support. I've already talked about the top side of this map in this video. Zika's been really solid. He's been one of the few top laners that has actually been able to have an effect on the game. He's had really good laning phases, and he often likes to play really aggressive stuff. It honestly just feels like an upgraded version of the Invictus Gaming version of Zika, right? Which is always going to be a good thing. You brought him in to be a little bit more of a spark on the top side. Ale wasn't exactly working out in terms of management or in terms of player cohesion last split, if the rumors are to be believed, and so getting kind of a very similar player, in my opinion, to Ale and Zika, who, you know, turned out to be nearly as good this split, is a huge win for them. I'm sure they're paying him much less as well. And then, obviously, I've talked at length about the mid-jungle duo already. Scout was MVP for good reason. He was the best player in the league, or the most valuable player to his team. But Tarzan was very close. He was also great. He's awesome on these more supportive, you know, initiative-type things like Sejuani, like the Vi, even things like the Lee Sin, you know, Xin Zhao when that was meta. Like, those are the things that Tarzan, I think, plays at a really high level. I don't think he's necessarily like a super high resource player, which is good because Scout wants those resources, and he does really well with those resources. The only players that we really haven't talked about in depth on this team so far have been LP and Hang down in the bot lane, and I think that they're fine. They're okay. They're serviceable. But if you're going to look at a weak point of this team that you could potentially be able to attack in a playoff series, it is almost certainly going to be this bot lane, these two players. Now, Hang is good, especially on engagers. That's going to be his bread and butter. You can see he played 8 games of Leona this split. That's a lot, considering Leona was meta approximately 0 games of this split. And so for Hang to be pulling her out so efficiently and, like, so consistently, I would say, not necessarily a good look for him in terms of, you know, versatility at the position, but at the very least, he's still a good engaged player, and that's likely what you're going to get out of him. He's always going to be better when he can roam around the map and help the rest of his team. The problem is that LP isn't a particularly great laner. He is definitely the weak link, but I do think that he has shown some things that make me feel a little bit more confident about him. I was very worried about him going into the split. He was a big reason why this team came in as low as 7th in my preseason power rankings, was because I was just concerned that LP wasn't going to hold up, especially against better talent in the LPL, and, you know, he's coming onto a team that wants to win right away. I just wasn't exactly sure how that was going to last for him, but he's certainly been sufficient enough, I'll say, in order to survive at this level. Now, is he going to be good enough to survive in a best of 5 when teams are going to target him? I don't know. Varus has been a massive pick for this team over the course of the year. It allows him to be a little bit, you know, aggressive in laning phase, but also it means that he can scale into the late game. It's a very safe pick for him. Doesn't really require you to do too much. All you need to do is kind of be there for fights, and you're probably going to be useful. But when he's forced onto things like the Aphelios, even the Zeri that he has a good win rate on, it's just not the same, I would say. He's not the kind of carry player that's going to be able to win them major games in the playoffs, and that just gets to their playstyle, which is Tarzan and Scout. I mean, straight up, like, I'm going to be entirely honest with you. It is about these two players when it comes to LNG. When they play really, really well, they probably win, because together as a duo, they are probably the scariest duo in the LPL right now. I can't, off the top of my head, think of a duo that I'm more scared of getting ahead than Tarzan and Scout. However, they don't have a backup plan. Like, they just simply do not have what the top 2 teams have, in my opinion, which is other players that can step up and versatility in how they want to draft and how they want to play. They very much rely on the early game of Tarzan to be able to set up the mid to late game of Scout, and when they don't really get that, they don't really win. We saw that in their 3 series losses this year to good teams. When these players are outmatched, or at least neutral, they don't really have a lot of outs. They don't have a lot of avenues to kind of fix that, and so LNG definitely has a lot of positives, considering they have maybe the most fearsome duo in the entire league, but teams are for sure going to target them in terms of draft and in terms of early pressure, and it's going to be interesting to see if they can hold up, or if players like Zika and LP can really step up and kind of take the reins in a super important time for LNG. This is a team that very realistically could even win the split, I think, if everything went right, but for me, I just have a slightly less confidence in them than I do in teams like JDG and EDG. And then moving on to our number 4 seed, the team that is grouped in this, like, round 4 kind of explosion, round 3, I should say, kind of, entrance into the tournament. Coming in at the number 4 seed, we have Weibo Gaming, and talk about a feast or famine team. When they are on, they look like the best team in the entire universe, and it's not particularly close. When they are not, well, let's just say that this team can and will lose to anybody if they're not playing well. Their lineup is looking like the Shy in the top lane, Karsa in the jungle, Xiaohu in the mid lane, Light at AD carry, and Crisp as support. It's kind of wild to look at the screen and see that Crisp is the one who made All-Pro. Not that Crisp is a bad player at all, obviously. Former world champion, that's got to count for something, I would say, and, he's a good player, but we've already talked about him quite a bit, so let's kind of talk about the other players on this team and why they are so feast or famine. You shouldn't have to ask that question when you see a top side of the Shy, Karsa, and Xiaohu. You kind of know why they're so volatile. Some of the most aggressive and, mechanically oriented players in the entire region. Maybe not Karsa, but the Shy and Xiaohu are definitely two players that are going to try to push the envelope, going to try to create their own advantages. The Shy has been notorious for that for years. It's a big reason why he's got one of the biggest fan bases of any player in the world. It's because he might just be the most the most talented player in the world, but man, his macro decisions and his ability to die consistently has just been so ridiculously high, even especially over the last few years. I will say, though, I would honestly call 2023 one of his more contained years. Now, I'm not exactly sure that's going to last. We kind of said something similar in 2022 towards the back half of the summer regular season when it felt like he was getting things under control, but then we got back into the playoffs where games really mattered and he defaulted back to his normal, I'm going to crush lane and, I'm gonna, if I get pressured, then I'm probably just going to die mentality, but, the Shy's incredibly good. It's just about, can he piece it together? I don't think he's the most important player on this team. That distinction, in my opinion, falls to the jungle mid. And I know I've said that a lot about a lot of LPL teams, but truthfully, there are a lot of really good mid laners and a lot of good junglers in the LPL that are going to try and push the envelope forward. Karsa gets such a bad rap from the community, and I get it because he's this more facilitative jungler that doesn't really take resources. He doesn't outwardly carry games, and, he can have outwardly bad games, and so I think it's more easily noticeable that he is not good in some of these games than, that he is, actually smurfing, but let me tell you, watching every single Karsa game this year, he was by far an asset to this team. I know a lot of people are going to say he was bad for Weibo. This was a good split for Karsa. I thought he worked well with Xiaohu, and he was really good in the early game. 10-1 on Vi, 7-2 on Sedge, 4-2 on Elise. This is the style he wants to go for. Vi and Elise in particular really want to generate those early leads, and they're very easy to do so on. I think overall Karsa is a big positive for this team, and if he plays well, if he has a good series, that's going to be huge for whoever Weibo goes up against, but also Xiaohu, and again, kind of similar to Karsa, he's had phenomenal games. I would say, unlike Karsa, he's had very standout performances, very noticeable performances, especially when he wins. I think you could make a real argument that he's the second best Syndra in the world, only behind Knight. I think you could make the argument that he is the best Taliyah in the world. His champion pool is, I don't want to say shallow, but it's certainly, what he wants to play, but he plays it so well that it's honestly kind of difficult to deal with. Not to say he can't go outside of that box. He is definitely adaptable, but I think they definitely want to play more towards his comfort zones, and those are the champions that he has always done really well on. I mean, summer 2022 Taliyah really proved how good he was on that champion, and he has continued to be that, but Xiaohu is also going to overextend at times. Again, a lot of teams like to focus the mid lane here because they know that Xiaohu being behind is a problem for Weibo because they don't have a ton of great side lane control unless the Shy is on something super aggressive that can actually control it and, you're not sending pressure up to the top side. I'm thinking something like the Fiora, something like the Renekton even. If you don't have that, it's actually kind of unlikely for them to have side lane control, and, Light is a big reason for that. I love Light as a player, and I think he's been hyper consistent for this team, and it's going to come across like I'm talking ill of him, but he's just not this big, dominating player in lane phase. He was last year, but I definitely think he's taken more of a weak side role on Weibo, which, generally speaking, I agree with in terms of your team construction, but it just makes it a little bit more difficult for Weibo to be able to pressure early on in games. The only thing that they've really played that's all that aggressive in the early game is the Xayah Rakan, and they have brought it out, especially towards the back half of the split, but even the Lucian Nami that they brought out quite a bit this year has just not been that same level of aggression that you see from some of the other LPL bot lanes. That's not to say they can't play forward and they can't play with jungle support. It's just not something that Weibo likes to go to all the time. Light is used as an insurance policy to make sure the rest of the game goes well, and I think that works for Weibo. Again, talent-wise, when Karsa, Xiaohu, and the Shy in Light are, all clicking, this team can win the split. I said earlier on in my weekly reviews, and I think, 2 months ago or whatever, when they beat JDG, that this team could win MSI. Like, they have the talent to win MSI, and I wouldn't be, like, entirely surprised. Like, I think it's within the realm of possibility. That's how good this team is, but the problem is getting there game in and game out has just not been an efficient strategy for Weibo, basically, at any point throughout the year. The talent is 1,000,000% there, but, you know, ensuring that they bring out the talent and even more so ensuring that they play up to their opponents has always been a question mark. There are certain matchups in the playoffs that I would consider quite bad for Weibo. I think they're just hoping and praying that they don't run into one of those. And then moving on to our 5th seed now. We're done with the 3rd and 4th seed, you know, round 3 entrance. It's time for the final 2 teams to cover in this little one-team preview section before we jump into our round 1 matchups. Number 5 seed, and a pretty interesting team to talk about here is Bilibili Gaming coming in here. I think a lot of people had a lot of high expectations for this team, me included, going into the year, and while it certainly didn't feel like they entirely met those expectations in the regular season, a lot of the reason for excitement is absolutely still here on this team. So let's go ahead and go over what they've got. In the top lane, they've got Bin. In the jungle, it's Shun. In the mid lane, it's Yagao. And the bot lane, it's Elk. And at support, it's On. I've already talked a bit about a couple of these players, Elk and On in particular, so I'm going to start with them because I do think that they are the power side for Bilibili. Jun and Yagao, we'll get into. I know I've talked a lot about mid-jungle duos. They're the biggest reason I'm concerned, and not because they're bad individual players, but we'll get to that in a bit. Elk and On have been awesome. They have been the anchor for this team. Elk is top 3 in MVP voting for me for a reason. It's because of the absolute dominance that they have been able to show both in and out of lane. Elk has been one of the most proficient laners on basically anything you give him, whether that's Lucian, whether that's Varus. They played a little bit of Xayah towards the back half of the split, but even something like Zeri or Aphelios, he's done really well on in lane. He's just super aggressive. He's willing to go out there and make plays, and I really think that that pairs up well with a support like On, who just wants to go out there and try and influence the game as much as possible. We talked about On being a little bit feast or famine, I would say, overall for BLG. He can have some really good games. He can also have some really, really terrible games, and that's just his playstyle. That's what he's going to do. He's not going to not try to make plays. I call him the LPL's Hylissang. I think they play very similarly, and just like Hylissang, he can be a major positive and basically impossible to deal with when he is on. He loves hook champions. You'll see the Nautilus and the Thresh in his top 3 here, but the Blitzcrank is something that I consider On's signature champion, and he's certainly not going to be afraid to pull that out at times in the playoffs. Overall, if these two can generate a lead early, that's super good for BLG. That is their main strategy. That's what they like to go to, but good for them. Like, they do play the Zeri. They do play the Aphelios. They can scale into the late game as well. Elk is a spectacular team fighter. He really has always been a spectacular team fighter. He's really just an all-around great player so long as he has team support. And I think BLG knows that, and that's why they play around him so efficiently. But bot lane is probably going to make or break a lot of what this team ends up doing in the playoffs. Bin in the top lane is another player that I'm really interested in. At points in time, we were calling him the best top laner in the LPL, and I think it was rightfully so. Now, I'm not saying that he is, like, completely fallen from grace. He's had a couple of really good games, but 2023 has not really been his year. I talked about there really not being any top laners to step up. That should typically mean that the really mechanically talented ones like Bim are able to kind of separate themselves from the middle of the pack. He just wasn't able to do that in 2023. People always talk about that swap between RNG and BLG Bin for Breathe, but I don't think either of them really had their best splits in 2023 so far, and I think that shows. Now, Bin is certainly someone who can take over playoff series. I distinctly remember last year for this BLG team in the playoffs where they, you know, were really, he was really tough to actually take down. He had a really good playoff series, but it'll be interesting to see if that carries over. He's kind of been an inconsistent playoff performer over the course of his career, but if you get him on carries, he's going to at least be a power point of the map, and I think carries in the top and bot lane work out because you've got Yagao in the mid lane, probably the best supportive mid laner, or at least the most prestigious, like, actively supportive mid laner, right? Someone who's going to pull out Galio and Talia and Twisted Fate and Rise, and basically that's it, right? He's not going to be playing for heavy resources, and that's a big reason why I was excited about BLG to start this year, is it felt like players like Bim and Elk could really start to shine with a player like Yagao next to them, because really what he's done is just make everybody around him look better for the entirety of his career. He got off to a ridiculously slow start to start the year. He was one of the worst mid laners in the entire region, I would say, through the first 2 or 3 weeks, but everything has kind of come together for him over the past 4 or so weeks, and I think he's in pretty good form heading into the playoffs, and so Yagao is Yagao. We kind of know what he is. He's still one of the more interesting mid laners in the world, and I don't think that should be taken for granted. What I don't like about Yagao on this team is his personal synergy with Shun in the jungle, which has just not come together really at all. Yagao and Kanavi had such perfect synergy in 2022 that we almost got spoiled. To see him come over to BLG invests in a young jungler that I really liked on Invictus Gaming and Shun, and it's just not worked out as a duo for them. They really have never seemed to be on the same page. Shun has really just become kind of a Vi one-trick over the back half of the split, and it's worked. Obviously, it's been positive for them, but you know, I was really excited about Shun potentially playing some of these more attacking aggressors. Obviously, the Nidalee comes to mind, but any kind of poke, early game, aggressive pick like that, Elise comes to mind as well, as something that I really wanted to see BLG be more willing to bring out, but it just doesn't seem like they want to play for mid-jungle early at all, even with Yagao willing to give up resources for it. So if that's their strategy, if you just want Shun on something that can engage in the mid-game, you know, support something like a backline hyper carry, AD carry, and then, you know, put Bin on something that he can win 1v1 on in the top lane, I think that's a perfectly fine strategy. I do think it limits you a little bit. If you can have this big takeover game out of the jungle or the top lane, I would feel so much more comfortable with BLG as a team moving forward, but until they prove that, I'm just going to be a little bit hesitant about whether or not that's actually going to happen. But for now, Elk and On are surely good enough to be able to win them some games, maybe some series on their own, but if the rest of these players step up, this could be one of the most dangerous teams in the entire tournament. And then the final team to get a bye in round number 1, our number 6 seed, and one of the teams that I was pounding the drum for the most in the preseason, we have, oh my god, OMG coming in here as the number 6 seed. And this is exactly where I predicted them in my preseason power rankings. People were kind of upset with that. They thought I way overrated OMG. I put them ahead of teams like LNG, which doesn't look great in hindsight, but even teams like ThunderTalk that were getting a lot of, you know, big hype by a lot of the rest of the fans, you know, a team like Ninjas in Pajamas that was also getting hype at the time. I felt really comfortable in OMG. I felt like this was the year that a lot of these young players finally put it together, and while I wasn't entirely spot on how they would get it done, I was spot on it being the year that OMG really did step up because they were solid. Their lineup is looking like Shanji in the top lane, Aki in the jungle, Cream in the mid lane, Abel at AD carry, and PP God, our Lord and Savior, at support. OMG's just really solid across the board. This team is consistently underrated and undervalued by a lot of the analysts that I've seen. They've been really good over the course of the split, and consistent too. What I think has really impressed me the most about this team in general is their ability to actually play against good teams. They aren't just beating the bad teams and losing to the best ones. They are beating some of the best teams in the entire league consistently. They look really good when they go up against good teams, and you know, sometimes they struggle a bit against some of the lower teams, but again, you're in the playoffs. You're not going to be playing against any of the lower teams. If there was ever a strategy, if you would rather be good against the good teams or the bad teams, you would much rather be good against the good teams in the LPL, and especially in the playoffs. And so a lot of positives here. What is their main game plan? Well, this split, it has honestly been Aki in the jungle, which I found entirely surprising. That's not really what they wanted to do over the past few years. They were very solo lane dominant last year in particular. Shanji was a lot of fun to watch. Obviously, he's got some signature picks. He played a ton of Cassante this year, but when you think about Sanji, you think about the AP kind of, you know, off-tank, off-bruiser carries, off-mage even really carries. Things like the Rumble, things like the Shyvana obviously come to mind for Shanji. The Shyvana's not really been relevant in 2023, but the Rumble sure has, and that's the kind of playstyle that I think he really kind of specialized in going into this year, but he's definitely become a lot more proficient playing on the weak side, and that's been to a huge benefit to OMG because they can invest their resources elsewhere. Cream was also somebody who I think was a little bit poor without resources in 2022, and he still does get a lot of resources when you're looking at the lanes that do get investment here from Aki in particular. In the early game, Cream is definitely at the top of that list. He is your Zeka. Like, he is very similar. There's a reason that I'm super high on both of these players. It's because I really don't think the difference between them is all that massive. I think Cream is really, really fun to watch. Obviously more melee-oriented, more assassin in particular-oriented, things like the Akali. Even the LeBlanc is definitely a part of his, you know, repertoire, but the Sylas, the Yone, that kind of stuff is always going to be what he's most comfortable and most familiar on, but he is a little bit more versatile than people give him credit for, and I think that, you know, subsection of champions, of melee assassin champions, is wide enough where, especially like the relevant ones in the meta, where Cream is going to be fine. Now, he was really good on Ryze in a couple of games this split as well. That's definitely something to keep in mind, but teams have kind of moved away from Ryze, I would say, as the split went on. So it's going to be interesting to see what they end up going with in the mid lane. But if Aki and Cream can kind of get a hold on the game early, if Cream can get ahead, he's an awesome snowballer. I think that's what he does almost better than any mid in the LPL, or at least outside of like the unbeatable, you know, completely broken mids in the LPL, is he just snowballs the crap out of the game. You do not want to give him a lead because he will do everything with it. And Aki's incredibly efficient in the jungle as well. But then you've got Abel and PP God they've been fine, and that's kind of what they are. That's kind of what Abel has been his entire career, is fine. He's phenomenal on Aphelios, right? Obviously, Samira is kind of a standout, like, signature pick, but Aphelios is right up there with her, in my opinion. They are two very popular picks for him for a reason. Once you move him outside of the Aphelios, it's not nearly as much of an impact, especially in the mid game, where he really does struggle on a lot of other champions. But if they leave a champion like Aphelios up, that means, or if they ban out a champion like Aphelios, I should say, it means you're not spending a ban on, like, Cream, or you're not banning PP God's Renata, which has been so good, or his Rakan, which has been, you know, historically really good, but, you know, or Wukong, which Aki's played really well on, or Cassante or Rumble, or whatever you want to ban out from Shanji. Like, this team just has too many signature picks to actually be able to deal with them consistently, and that's what I was talking about in the preseason. You hear a lot of people talk about how these players are not versatile, about how they're very specific in terms of the play styles they like to play. While that might be true, they simply have too many champions that they can play at that play style that you can't really ban them out. If they want to play that style, they probably will be able to play that style, and that makes for a very difficult playoff series. It also makes for a rather predictable game plan. If you can get Aki behind, this team struggles a lot. There weren't a lot of games where Aki was playing from behind, but when he did, they often lost, and PP God's kind of in a similar boat. He's not a great player playing from disadvantage. He's really good when he can control the map and be aggressive and place wards aggressively, but when he has to play from behind, he can get a little bit too aggro in some of these plays. Now, it's not to say it's impossible. I think Shanji's a really good team fighter. I think Abel's a really good team fighter, especially on Aphelios, but you know, I certainly don't think this team wants to be playing from behind in general, and I think Aki in particular is going to benefit a lot from being able to kind of carry that torch early on in the game. But overall, OMG is a super fun team to watch, probably my most fun team to watch in the LPL so far this year, and hopefully they continue that reputation and prove it in the playoffs. But now that we've covered the 6 teams that are going to get a bye in round number 1, it's time to cover the 4 teams that are going to be facing off against each other in this first round. And we're going to be doing so in some matchup analysis. I'm really excited to go over this. I'll be going over the strengths and weaknesses of each team like normal, like I did for these others, but I'll also be adding in how I think they are going to fare in their particular matchup in the first round, because really their general outlook isn't as important if they can't get out of round number 1. And so it's the most important thing to talk about, and we shall. But let's go ahead and kick us off with our first round 1 matchup, which is the number 8 seeded ThunderTalk Gaming taking on the number 9 seeded Royal Never Give Up. And this is an incredibly intriguing matchup. ThunderTalk makes playoffs for the first time in their history. RNG was very, very close to missing playoffs for the first time in their org's history. This is not a matchup that you would particularly look at and say, it's close. It's certainly not 2 organizations that have been close in recent splits, but both kind of moving in closer directions, I would say, over the course of 2023. ThunderTalk has definitely emerged as one of the more interesting teams in the league. I still have some question marks about their ability to play entirely consistent, and a lot of that has to do with the mid-jungle duo, which I will get into in a bit, but I actually want to kind of divert expectations a bit and talk about this bot lane first and foremost for ThunderTalk, because when you're talking about some of the most underrated players in the LPL, to me it is absolutely still both members of this bot lane. Huanfeng, Yao Yao have both been incredibly good players over the course of the split. I loved Yao Yao last year. I thought he was super underrated for how good he was towards the back half of that split. If they had gotten good, ThunderTalk, that is, just a tad bit sooner, like a week or 2 sooner, if him and Kepler came in like maybe a week before they actually did, I think they probably make playoffs. They were on such a surge towards the back half. They're able to retain him in the offseason. They don't start him at the beginning of the year because of course they don't. It's ThunderTalk. Of course they're going to start Jin Liu, who's just never really been a fantastic LPL player over him, but as soon as they got to their, senses and actually put him in the lineup, him and Huanfeng have been playing really well. Huanfeng in general has just been maybe the most overlooked and underrated player in the LPL over the past year or so. He was really good last year on Weibo. I do think that On got a lot of credit for a lot of the plays that ended up being made on that team, but Huanfeng definitely deserved a lot of the credit as well. But I do think that his consistency is something that I really value. I don't think you're really going to see a lot of bad games out of Huanfeng, which is crazy considering what he was like early on his career. I think that he's completely changed the narrative about himself. And honestly, he's just been a good presence down there in the bot lane for ThunderTalk. I can't really remember the last time these two were absolutely blasted in lane, and that's going to help because you're going up against Gala and Ming in the bot lane, who might be the most underrated bot lane in the entire league, right? Like, I know a lot of people aren't going to give them all-pro nods because their team was bad, but God, they dragged this team across the finish line. And if any bot lane is going to be able to go up and quite frankly just consistently beat Huanfeng and Yao Yao, it's probably going to be Gala and Ming, who are just so incredibly solid. Again, Ming's win rates don't look all that good, but he was great on Ashen, he's great on Engagers, and we know that he's very, adept at things like Nami, even if the win rate isn't quite there. He's just a really good player overall, and probably one of the best supports in the entire world. And Gala, mechanics-wise, is right up there with anybody. I mean, he's world-class in that regard. The only complaint I've ever had with Gala, and I've repeated this over and over, is I just wish he would be slightly more aggressive in how he played a lot of the matchups. I feel like a lot of times in lane, he can just be a little bit too passive. He can let the game come to him a little bit too much. I like to see AD carries take the game into their own hands, especially one that's as talented as Gala is. But, talent-wise, he's right up there with basically anybody in the entire world. And then you've got the mid lane matchup, UCal versus Angel. Now, this is one I'm actually going to put in favor of ThunderTalk. I think ThunderTalk should absolutely have this one in the bag, in my opinion. UCal has actually been quietly very good this split. Now, I do want to mention, he's been slightly worse, I would say, over the last, 3 or so weeks of the split. He's had a couple of bad games here or there, which is okay. You can live with that, but Angel has just not been a positive. This mid lane position has been a major negative for RNG basically the entirety of this year. They started with Tong Yuan in there, and then eventually they went to Angel, but they were flip-flopping, and then they settled on him, and the team got a little bit more consistent, but it never really clicked. Mid lane's just kind of been a black hole for RNG, and as much as I like Angel, I think he's okay. I think he's a mid-tier LPL mid laner. He really hasn't performed like that this split. Honestly, he's been a below-average mid laner, and a below-average mid laner in the LPL is not a good sign, especially going into a player like UCal, who has done a really good job taking advantage of some of the weaker mids in the region. I think this could be the part of the matchup that goes pretty firmly in favor of ThunderTalk, but it's kind of accentuated by the jungle matchup, and this is probably the most back-and-forth matchup. Wei is more talented than Beishwan. I'm going to be entirely honest. I'm a big fan of Beishwan. I like him a lot as a player, but even I can say that Wei is just simply better. I don't think he's played better this split. Wei's actually been a bad player for RNG, I would say, over the course of the year. If it weren't for the mid lane position, I would say Wei is their biggest problem, but mid and jungle in general have not been kind to RNG in 2023. Now, Wei historically performs really well in the playoffs as a player who has been not only to Worlds multiple times, but he's won MSI. He's a very distinguished, established player. It's just not necessarily clicked for him with the current pieces that are around him. I still do think that he can be one of those players that just turns it on in the playoffs and never looks back, but I need to see it a bit before I just believe it. And Beishwan is not a pushover. I know he can be a little bit inconsistent, and that's really the thing with him, but when he's on, man. He's ridiculously mechanically talented. I honestly see him as a slightly better version of a player like Leon on Rare Atom, where yes, he's able to generate really strong early game leads, but he does actually have an idea of how to transition them. It's just not very good from behind, right? He's not very good at losing. He doesn't lose gracefully. But sometimes you can live with that, because you should be winning early anyways. That's definitely what you're going to be looking for. So, jungle matchup's interesting. Top lane matchup, not so much. I mean, Breeze had a little bit of a down split. Hoya is just kind of a good player. He's a solid player, not one that I would consider entirely exceptional. Just kind of consistent, solid. A lot of the range that you would put a player like Cube or someone like that in. Just a player who you're certainly not going to be mad about having on your team, but probably isn't going to be carrying you across the finish line. And RNG really hasn't invested a ton into Breathe. He's been on Scion duty basically the entirety of the last few weeks. He's been really good at it, but top lane's probably going to be a wash in the series. But that's going to bring me to my key matchup of the series. I've already talked about it a bit, but it's going to be the support matchup. It's going to be Yao Yao versus Ming, because I really do think bot lane is really going to be where this series is decided mostly. I think mid lane is actually going to be pretty in favor of ThunderTalk, but none of it is going to matter if Gala and Ming are able to get ahead. I would say also ignore the stats up on the screen. They look really bad for supports in particular, because stats are just kind of weird for supports, and also LPL doesn't post a lot of their active statistics, and so it's actually very difficult in order to find stats for this slide. But, I'll just kind of talk about the matchup. Yao Yao is a very consistently good support. Ming is a consistently great support. If RNG's bot lane is going to be able to get the momentum and going to be able to get the jump on TT, then it's actually going to be pretty difficult. Gala is probably going to be able to run over a lot of what TT does, because they just don't really play all that aggro if Huanfeng is not able to position really well in team fights. And if he's behind, he's not going to be able to do that. But if ThunderTalk holds their own, if mid lane can win, if you can get a pretty good jungle performance out of Beishwan, and if Yao Yao steps up and goes head-to-head with a player like Ming and with a player like Gala, ThunderTalk could very easily take the series. Even though they lost in the regular season, I can absolutely see an avenue where this team is able to pull out a win, and I really don't think it is all that out of the realm of possibility. Now, I'm not going to give my prediction just yet. I'm going to be doing a full bracket prediction at the end here, but this is a really intriguing series, and I think no matter what, it's going to be fun to watch. And then moving on to our second series, our final series that we're going to be covering in this video, we have a matchup between the 7-seeded Top Esports and the 10-seeded Team WE. Definitely an intriguing matchup. No one thought Top Esports was going to be a round 1 team. They were not supposed to be a bottom 4 playoff team, but here we are. This team is looking like a top 2 team in the region, maybe even in the world, like for a lot of the early part of this year, and then things just absolutely collapsed. Like everything started being on fire. Nothing was going well for this team. Their good players were playing bad. Their bad players were playing bad, and nothing was really working. WE, on the other hand, kind of stepped it up over the back half of the split. They didn't have a playoff spot for most of 2023, but Invictus really started to struggle down the stretch, and WE came up in the clutch. They won the series they needed to, and here they are, making the playoffs after not having won a single series in summer of 2022, and so quite the turnaround from them. But matchup-wise, I think it is difficult to talk about, because on paper, Top Esports should, destroy them. There really is no lane that is not in favor of Top Esports, I think, just in general, but there are a lot of factors at play here that aren't necessarily, cut and dry, right? Like Top Esports' recent form. One thing that I want to point out, you can already see it on the graphic, Top Esports top laner has a star next to their name, because I think it's Wayward. Is Wayward playing? Is Qingtian playing? I have no idea. Qingtian played 15 of their 16 series this year, but Wayward played the last one, and he balled out. He absolutely dominated, and that was like a win or not get in kind of game. You needed to win that game in order to be in a much better spot here in round number 1, and they played Wayward. They felt confident going to him, so I'm going to assume it's Wayward. I'm going to kind of talk about them both. I think either way, it's very top lane favored for Top Esports. That should be no question. BuBu is one of the worst top laners in a major region right now. He's certainly one of the worst in the LPL. He's been super negative on anything that's not a complete meatball tank in the top lane, like Sion, like Cassante. Anything outside of that, he's been a pretty big train wreck on, but I generally think that the top laners for Top Esports are underrated anyways. I talked about this in my Week 10 review, but Wayward was actually really good for most of the regular season last year. Qingtian was maybe the best top laner in the league for the first 5 weeks of the split in 2023, just collapsed super hard, right? These players have talent. There's a lot of positives to take away from them. You can't really say the same for BuBu, so even if you have a low opinion of the Top Esports top laners, they should have the advantage in this matchup. Now, jungle's where it gets a little bit spicy. Tian versus Hang. I am super intrigued by this matchup. I was very close to making this my matchup of the series, because I truly do believe that it can go in either direction. That's not to say it should. Tian should be able to control this series, right? He is one of the best junglers that the LPL has ever seen at his absolute peak, but he has not played well, especially during this losing streak. And Hang has actually been pretty good over the back half of the split. He's been one of the more interesting junglers. He is Leon. We were talking about Beishuan, where it's a better version of Leon, where he has a really good early game, but, Beishuan knows how to transition it into the mid game. Hang has some unreal early games. He's able to get his laners super far ahead. He gets himself a ton of gold. He gets his team a ton of pressure, and he often throws it away. And that's something that I just hope will come with time for him in the LPL, because he obviously still is a rookie, but man, if he could lock it in, if he could come out and be better than Tian in every single early game, that's a problem for Top Esports, and I don't think that's entirely out of the realm of possibility to happen in this series. And then you've got JackeyLoveandMark versus Hope and Awandi. Very interesting matchup. Two contrasting styles, I would say, in general. I think when you're looking at a grand scheme of the split, you're looking at JackeyLoveandMark as the aggressive bot laners that want to try to generate leads early on things like Lucian Nami. Hell, they'll even play Varus Heimerdinger. They just want to be able to generate push and be able to move around the map to kind of force skirmishes to happen. And then Hope and Awandi are kind of the opposite. They are much more willing to scale. They do play some of these early game threats, but mostly just so that they can pressure out the early laning phase and get themselves into the mid game where they can then go to help their team. But recently, I think Hope and Awandi have been significantly more aggressive in the early game. They actually were really good in lane in the last week of the season. The problem is they really regressed a lot in team fights, I would say, over the course of the last week of the season. I don't think that will stick. I think generally speaking, especially when these games are a little bit more on edge and on the line in the playoffs, I think that they're probably going to resort to being a little bit more passive in the early game. I think that can open up a lane for JackeyLoveandMark to be able to generate advantages. They should be the better bot lane, but Hope and Awandi are sneaky consistent, and it might just be a wash, quite frankly, in the bot lane. I wouldn't be surprised if both of these teams were just a little bit too afraid to play through that one specific lane. But JackeyLove, awesome playoff performer historically, except for a couple specific, performances. But generally speaking, a great playoff performer. But that's going to bring us to our one matchup that's left, and it's my key matchup of the series. It's the mid lane matchup. It's Rookie versus Shanks in the mid lane. This is definitely the most important matchup this series. Not only is Shanks WE's best player, and certainly the one that they rely on the most to be able to win in the late game, but Rookie has not been on his A game over the last few games. I will say, first in damage percentage, second in damage per minute. That's pretty darn good. Like, over the first half of this split, he was Rookie. He was everything that we could have wanted on Top Esports. He was a big reason why we considered this team one of the best in the entire world. But that collapse, man, he was awful over the last, I don't know, like 2.5 weeks of the split. If he can just get back to form, if he can get some confidence back, I don't know what it is, but if he can just get back online, this really should be no contest. Top Esports should be able to take it, but Shanks is not a pushover, and if Rookie's struggling, if we get the version of Rookie that's maybe not playing at the highest level, Shanks is the kind of player that can actually take advantage of that. And I think that kind of shows. He's second in damage percentage in the league as well. He does a ridiculous amount for this WE team. Fourth in gold per minute, even sixth in damage per minute. Like, that's not bad, especially considering the amount of phenomenal mid laners we have here in the LPL. This is certainly not a matchup that you can consider to be completely one-sided. If Rookie doesn't show up and play like he did early in the season, if we get the more modern version of Rookie, Shanks has a real chance to be a hero in this series against a really good team in Top Esports. But generally speaking, Top, it's all going to be up to them. If they play up to their standard, this series should be relatively in their favor. Alright, but now that we have covered every single team in depth, not only that, all of the matchups, and also all of the awards, it is time to get into my full bracket predictions for the LPL Spring Split 2023 playoffs. I'm really excited to do this. This is going to be a long one, so I may rush through some of the series explanations, especially some of the earlier ones, but know that I have thought about this a lot, and I'll kind of give some of the reasons why I ended up picking who I'm picking. Of course, disclaimer at the beginning, I'm not going to get all these right. I'm just not. There's too many games. Something's going to go wrong. But at the end of the day, I do think that I have shown in the past that I am pretty good at picking upsets, or at least pretty consistent at picking upsets. They don't always work out, but I have a better track record of hitting than I do missing. And so that's a pretty good sign going into this year. But as you'll see, I'm definitely not shying away from some spicy picks. You probably noticed that if you watch some of the other regions. I'm definitely not avoiding spicy picks in my playoff predictions. But let's go ahead and start it, kicking off with the first round. And let's go over the series that we already talked about a little bit quicker. In our 8-9 matchup between ThunderTalk and RNG, I have RNG going over. I think they should be able to take care of ThunderTalk. I know they haven't had the best split, but they were able to pretty dominantly beat them the first time around. And really not a lot has changed for either team since then. That was after RNG kind of got their shit together. And ThunderTalk really, while they were a little bit more efficient towards the back end of the split, really never felt like a dominant team. Like, they weren't just beating everybody or anything like that. I think RNG talent-wise and just general atmosphere-wise should be able to take this series. Then the other series in round one, we've got Top Esports versus WE. I'm going to go Top Esports here. I think WE is just a little bit outmatched in this one. Again, I could definitely see a world in which a player like Hang gets ahead or Shanks does really well, and they're able to take the series, but I think realistically speaking, Top Esports really shouldn't have a problem with a team like WE. This shouldn't be a particularly close series. If it is, not a good sign for Top. Moving on to round two, though, that means we now have RNG versus BLG, a very intriguing matchup, especially considering some of the players, but I'm going to give this one to BLG. I think Bilibili should be able to take this one. RNG just doesn't have it this split. They're not clicking in the same way, and I don't think that's just a regular season thing. If I had to predict, I think that's going to last throughout the playoffs, and I think that is represented here. I do think they have enough to get by ThunderTalk, but not enough to get by a pretty talented BLG team that just has the best player in the series in Elk. And then on the bottom side, this is where things get spicy because I'm going Top Esports. I'm going Top Esports over OMG. And that's going to be frustrating to some fans, but of all the teams to complain to me that I'm not high enough on, OMG really can't be the one. I think I've been the highest on them of anybody in the entire world over the past year or so. But I know this team's limitations. I know what they're not capable of doing. What they're not capable of doing, in my opinion, is ousting teams that are just able to get early leads on them. And I trust Top Esports' talent a little more here. Now, OMG has done really good against good teams. Good thing Top Esports has not been playing all that well. Jokes aside, I think Top Esports really does have a lot of really good mechanical talent, and they've really gotten a lot better, I'd say, over the last week or so. It wasn't a perfect final week of the season, but that last series was so dominant. I honestly feel like I have a little bit more faith in Top Esports than other people are going to have. And so they're going to advance here for me. And then moving on to round three, our final round before we get to, beat to the top four and also losers bracket. So you don't want to lose here. Again, you do not want to be a 4 or 3 seed that loses here because then you won't even get a chance to avenge yourself. Only the top 2 teams are guaranteed losers bracket. But let's talk at the top side of the bracket here. Bilibili Gaming versus Weibo is very intriguing. I think these are the two maybe most similar teams in the entire league, both kind of carried by specific players. But to me, I like Weibo's chances in this one just a tad bit more. I think BLG has been It's just a little bit too inconsistent for me. I really like Xiaohu's chances into Yagao in spring. Xiaohu always does well in playoffs, and especially the King of Spring is going to perform here. But Karsa, I think, has a really good matchup in Dashun. I think that's the kind of player that Karsa likes to take advantage of. And Bin versus the Shy, I think, is interesting. But really, I just don't think that Weibo's bot lane is going to be in a position for Elkanon to be able to generate the same kind of leads that they have in some of the other series. I think that Weibo is actually going to be able to survive that, and Xiaohu will be able to push them forward. And then we get to LNG versus Top Esports, the MVP versus the team that has been struggling. And I'm picking the team that's been struggling. I'm picking Top Esports. I know I'm crazy, right? Like, again, I want to go for some spice in this video, and this is some spice. I have Top Esports making top 4. And, 4 weeks ago, that wouldn't have been a crazy take even a little bit, but right now, it's pretty wild. I have LNG not winning a playoff series here in my predictions. I just think Top Esports is the better team, if I'm being quite honest. LNG strikes me as a team that really is not going to do all that well in best of fives. They have pretty clear weaknesses with pretty clear strengths, but, predictable teams like that traditionally have just not done well in best of fives. A player like LP going up against Jackie Love in a series in a best of 5, that scares me. Like, I don't know how that can not scare anyone. Like, I understand that, Scout into Rookie might be LNG favored, right? And Tarzan into Tian is definitely LNG favored, but Jackie Love into LP, that might be the biggest gap of any series that we have talked about so far. I think Jackie Love's going to pop off in the series. I think Top Esports is going to be able to take it, and I think they move on to the top 4. So we have our top 4. It's Weibo, JDG, EDG, and Top Esports. Let's go ahead and talk about how we get to the finals. Of course, winning here puts you in winners finals. Losing here puts you in the lower bracket. And as for WBG versus JDG, Weibo Gaming versus JD Gaming, I've got JD Gaming. I was so close, and I mean so close, to picking Weibo in this one. I think if there is a series that JDG can lose super easily in the playoffs, it's probably Weibo. They probably are the team that has the best chance of beating a team like JDG, but I'm predicting, and no spoilers, I'm predicting JDG to be pretty darn good in these playoffs, and so I have them going over here. But again, I can't reiterate enough. If Weibo beats JDG, I will be the least surprised person in the entire universe. And then the other upper bracket matchup here, EDG versus Top Esports. I have EDG. I'm not going that far. I'm not picking Top Esports over EDG. This is a team that I feel really confident about, and I think EDG should be able to take care of business here. Top Esports just doesn't have the consistency, and I really don't like the matchup of JJ into Tian. I think that is probably going to be a big game changer for EDG, just in general. I'll lay into whoever the top laner is for TES could also be pretty big, but EDG should have this one just based off of matchups. And then for 4th place, we've got Weibo Gaming versus Top Esports. Remember, you're not out of the tournament. You can still make MSI one of these teams, and the team that I have moving on to the losers finals, I have Weibo Gaming. I think that they are just better than Top Esports in most aspects. Top definitely has some things going for them in this series. I do like Jackie Love into someone like Light, but if Light's able to neutralize a lot of that aggression, then it's basically a wash. But mostly the reason I'm going for Weibo here, it's the King of Spring versus Rookie, who's just not been having a good split. I trust Xiaohu just a little bit more than I trust Rookie right now, and that to me is the big difference maker. And I have Weibo moving on to losers finals, but who's going to be joining him and who's going to be heading to MSI? Remember, winning winners finals heads you immediately to MSI, because the 2 teams who are in the finals make MSI. So is it going to be JDG or EDG coming from winners bracket? It's going to be JDG. I have JDG being able to pick up that series. Again, I just think this team is ridiculously strong. If EDG pushes them, I'm not going to be surprised, but I would also not be particularly surprised if JDG, 3-0 obliterated them, right? Because that's just what they can do. That's the kind of potential that this team has. But that means JDG is going to be, at the very least, heading to MSI. Who's going to be joining them? Is it going to be EDG or is it going to be Weibo? I've got EDG. I think EDG and JDG are going to be the 2 teams that meet in the finals, and the 2 teams heading to MSI. I think Weibo is a really interesting team that is really close to being there, but to me, EDG is just a tad bit too consistent, and I actually think a lot of their best traits are going to come out in a prolonged best of 5, and I think that's what a lot of these will be. So poor Weibo finishing 3rd, but JDG and EDG in the finals, and just like in the winners finals, I have JDG going over in this one, and I predict JDG to be your champions coming out of spring playoffs. No big surprise coming out for me. I already put Top Esports into the top 4, and I think that's going to be shocking enough for a lot of people, and so I didn't feel the need to put, Weibo Gaming as the champions. I think JDG actually are the best team in the LPL and one of the best teams in the world, especially when they're playing right. It feels like they're going to be locked in for a lot of these series, especially because I know these players want to play at MSI. And I would expect them to be able to get the job done. I think that the best version of this team will come out in the playoffs, and honestly, I'm just really excited for it. But this could go a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different combinations that this could end up being. I could see Weibo in the finals. I could see LNG in the finals. I could see a team like Top Esports in the finals. I think I could be crazy enough to see a team like Bilibili in the finals, like if things were crazy enough. There were a lot of interesting teams in the LPL this split. This is just how I'm predicting things to break down, but I want to hear from you guys. How are you predicting things to break down? Let me know down in the comment section below how crazy I am for putting Top Esports into the top 4, how crazy I am for putting Weibo in the top 3. I want to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, also let me know what you guys think is going to be happening in round 1. That's going to be taking place basically as this video goes up, and so, oops, sorry about that. It's just my upload schedule, but I really do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like on this video. It really does mean a lot to me as a content creator. We put a ton of time and effort into these videos. We're posting every single day, and that's a nice little reminder to hit subscribe if you're new here, because we're posting every single day, not only about the LPL, but about every single major region, as well as the NACL, and playoffs are here, man. If you're not subbed now, like, what are you waiting for? It's LOL Esports time. It's playoff time. Best time of the year. We do recaps every single day, so hit that sub button so you can get notifications when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.